So for our final session, we're in fact going to move over to Mark, who's still on screen, and he's going to talk to us sort of about a topic which has come up a number of times, the move to R, and I think in his case from SPSS to R. Mark was originally going to be doing this with a colleague who unfortunately can't make it, so Mark is going to be talking for both of them. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. So hopefully you can see that on my screen. Let me know if that's not the case. So one second.
Yeah, no, we can see that.
Okay, just there we go. Yeah, so my colleague Russell Turk has been unable to join us at the last minute. Some of the stuff he was going to deal with in more detail with some of the stuff here, so I'm just going to have to gloss over that part that Russell was going to deal with. This is just our story of moving to teaching with R, teaching with R in a large department, and just what we learned and what went right and what went wrong. So just in terms of background, this may be well familiar to all of you, but just in case it's not, statistics is a major part of the field of psychology, and then a substantial proportion of the undergraduate curriculum in psychology, teaching curriculum, is devoted to statistical data analysis. So depending on how you count it, it's about 1/4 of all what we teach in psychology at undergraduate level is statistical data analysis. So for the longest time, right back to the 90s, I think, the dominant tool for teaching, the dominant software tool for teaching was SPSS. And it seems to me like this was international. It wasn't just here in the UK, but in any country that I'm aware of, SPSS was sort of just no questions asked. It was the tool that everybody used in psychology generally, and for teaching statistics in psychology. Now, within the last decade or more, a lot more people who are doing research in psychology have become increasingly familiar with R. It has just become part of their own research, data analysis. And with that growing expertise and experience with R amongst academic staff, there was then it felt like it was now a viable solution. It was a viable option to move teaching the software from that's used for teaching from SPSS to R. So there was a sufficient amount of staff expertise to consider that option. So with that kind of background, we sort of plunged into this a few years ago. So we had actually been teaching statistics modules with R for a long time, so going back over 10 years, but these were more advanced modules and optional modules. So it was in 2019-2020, that academic year, we made the move to entirely teaching with R. And that was actually at the same time as Andy just mentioned there, at the University of Sussex, psychology did that at the same time, and some other departments in the UK, Lancaster University and University of Plymouth. And by the way, certainly at NTU, we were inspired by the University of Glasgow to make this move. They had made this move just a few years before that, and it seemed like it had been a great success. So that's psychology at University of Glasgow. So we were it was really them that made us see that this was it was time to move, and it seemed like others moved at the same time. So in our first year doing this, that 2019-2020, so we just introduced it at the first year level. So we're talking about 3-year undergraduate degree courses here in psychology in England, and so we just introduced it at the first year level, and that way we've got a large department, and so there's around 1,000 students, and then there was around 40 staff members who would have been involved with the teaching of statistics or the research methods at that first level. So we're talking about 1,000 students in that first year, that first academic year of introducing it, and our familiarity required by around 40 academic staff members. And so by the following year, then there was around 2,000 students. So we're teaching at a first year level and second year level. And so around 2,000 students were being taught R, and then around 40, oh, sorry, that should be 80. I should have said 80, about double the number of staff were then involved with teaching statistics and data analysis. And so our expertise and our experience, familiarity was required by that number of staff. So that's around 80 staff members. And then the following year, R was then used for, as I'll explain in a moment, as part of the research project supervision. It was for data analysis as the research project supervision, which is a major part of the final year work, the work that students do in their final year. And so at this point then, we had around 3,000 undergraduate students using R, and around 120 staff members who needed to, in some sense, teach R. So this is, I'm kind of emphasizing these numbers because they make a big difference. So when we were teaching R there for many years, it was all on a small scale. Very small number of staff, small modules, usually optional, and it was very plain sailing. It was when you go up to this big scale, very large number of students, very large number of staff members, that issues that weren't there before now arise. So just in terms of what we teach, just very briefly, just kind of an overview of what of statistical data analysis teaching. So in the first year, students are taught a module on statistics and another module on research methods, and a major part of that research methods module would be statistical data analysis, quantitative data analysis. So the research methods module involves designing experiments and designing psychometric studies and collecting data and so on. But a vital part of all of that then is the analysis of that data. So students are doing 1 hour lecture per week, 1 hour statistics workshop per week, and then a 3-hour research methods lab session. And as I said, that's not just data analysis, but a vital part of it is data analysis. And then all the analysis is done using R. There was talk about sort of using some Excel, and there was even some talk about using some SPSS at the same time, but those ideas didn't, thankfully, go very far. And it is just R for everything, or at least anything serious. Perhaps some students will open up their data in Excel to look at it, but it's the serious work is all done in R. And so what we would cover there in the first year would be sort of introduction to R and RStudio, kind of obviously. A lot of time is spent on that, just explaining how everything works. Then things like data wrangling, data visualization, descriptive statistics. And then in terms of analyses, it would be obviously very introductory things, simple linear regression, t-tests, one-way ANOVA, and so forth. And then it's assessed, that all that work in first year is assessed using exams and multiple choice exams, and then, but also in terms of these the quantitative data analysis that they report in these lab reports. So it is actually a mixed way, a mixture of methods of assessment, which is, I think, important, has important consequences in terms of how they engage with learning of all this content. So the second year, so all students are in the same boat here. They're all being taught in the same way. there's no sort of options here. There's just the core material that is taught to all students in the psychology undergraduate program. So again, it's the same thing: 1 hour lecture per week, 1 hour statistics workshop, 3 hours of research methods, which again involves more than just statistical data analysis. But the statistical data analysis is a vital part. You cannot skip it. And so then, in terms of the topics that becomes, it's less introductory now. So multiple linear regression, mediation analysis, factorial ANOVAs, repeated measures ANOVAs, and then some generalized linear models, logistic regression and Poisson regression, and again assessed in the same way as a mixture of different assessment methods. When students get to their third year in psychology, they all have to do an independent research project, which is a major part of their final year work. So it's 1/3 of all the credits in that final year. And then around 80% of our students use quantitative data analysis. So the remainder do qualitative analysis. And that's a large number of students for whom this quantitative data analysis, statistical data analysis is a vital part of this research project, which is a vital part of their final year. And these students then are divided into groups of around 16 students, all organized around certain research themes. And so you could see these as like mini little classes. So groups of 16 students, and there's usually 2 staff members who are specializing in that particular topic, whatever it might be, some topic in psychology. And as we've seen, around 80% of those students then will need to do some relatively serious statistical analysis, and so they need to be kind of supervised doing that and taught well. And so there's quite a wide range of methods that are used at this level in the third year. So linear regression and repeated measures ANOVA, that does make up the bulk of it. That's really kind of this kind of standard bread and butter tools in psychology. But then other things like structural equation modeling and factor analysis, things that are used more in psychometrics, multi-level models, generalized linear models, that they are all done as well. So my point is that these all need to be taught to the students. The students are just learning this themselves at this point. There's also, incidentally, optional modules at third year level, and that's where things get really quite advanced for an undergraduate program. And so we're doing multi-level models, generalized linear models, we're Bayesian data analysis. We also use R Markdown there quite a lot, and students produce R Markdown based coursework using LaTeX as well. So that's kind of there's a lot of time and effort spent on that. So that of course though is an optional module, not all students need to will choose to do that. So just in terms of then how things evolve, so that was like an overview of what we do, but just in terms of how things evolved over the years. So as I said, we started in 2019, and we just jumped in, really. There wasn't a huge amount of planning, and it was basically taking what had been done before using SPSS and just transplanting, replacing the SPSS code and content with R, and it wasn't great. It wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't great. So the workshops were kind of organized around problem sets. So the students would come into workshops and there'd be sort of a set of problems for them to do, with the idea being that they would work through it and we would help them. What was happening is that even though these guides that we were producing were relatively good, students were actually copying and pasting code. So we would say, you do this in our studio and see what happens. And what they were doing was they were just copying and pasting. And it was not the idea, not the intention. So we wanted them to try to understand what the code was doing, but in fact, there was a lot of copying and pasting. So that was a problem that we had to deal with. We also then found that there was minimal direct instruction in using R because of that kind of problem set style that we were using in the workshops, and that wasn't great. We also found that we were using very inconsistent code style. So there was a mixture of base R style and tidyverse style, etc., and it just wasn't consistent for students. So they would see a tidyverse way of doing something and a base R way of doing something, and it was creating confusion. And then we had a lot of unnecessary complex code. So we had pipelines, some ggplot that was unnecessarily complex, and again, any code that was getting kind of 5 lines long or whatever, students were not really parsing it. They were just treating it as kind of a copy and paste issue. And then another problem we were encountering at this point was RStudio installation. So we were relying on the RStudio desktop, so asking students to install that on their own machines, and it was already installed on the university machines, but a lot of students were using their own machines even then. And even though it's a relatively straightforward process, it was just causing grief, which we would have preferred to avoid in those first few weeks. So we would have preferred to avoid spending any time at all troubleshooting installation problems during workshops. So by the following year, then, so things got derailed a bit because of the pandemic. So we had to go to fully online everything, as everybody did, and that just complicated things. But apart from that, we started relying more on RStudio Cloud. And now what we did was, and we still do, in fact, is that we introduced them to RStudio Cloud on day one, we're using the free plan. And now the free plan, as you know, it gives them about 25 hours a month, about 25 hours a month. And that is actually sufficient for when they're not using R very intensely, as they would be at the start there. So they didn't have to install R at the start. They could start using RStudio Cloud free plan, and that, you're up and running in minutes using that. And then we gradually, over the course of that year, and then particularly into their second year, get them to start relying on the desktop as their default. So we were using the free plan. We haven't paid that money that people have been mentioning, the very high fee for running RStudio Cloud or Posit Cloud now. So we were still relying on the free plan, but it seems like it's all going fine, really. This idea of just using the cloud at the start particularly, and then transitioning to the desktop as the default. And we started using more direct instruction, teaching students rather than just saying, you work on something and we'll help you. We're saying, this is how we're going to go through this. We're going to do whatever. We're going to do a regression analysis, and this is what we do. So, we're at the top of the classroom and we're explaining how to do it, and they're following along. And that's a much better way of doing everything, I think. And then we developed an R package, a custom R package, which solved a lot of problems. We could reduce down this complex code. So just to let me just see if I can bring this up here. So just very briefly, we were using ggplot and previously, so just the actual ggplot itself, and we wrote functions to wrap this ggplot. So instead of having to do ggplot AES x is equal to y is equal to all of that plus geom and so on, which students found quite overwhelming because they were being taught this in their first few weeks. We just wrote wrapper functions for all of that, and so we Tukey box plots and scatter plots and so forth were all being replaced, and all that ggplot code was being replaced by just these wrapper functions. Now, there's kind of for and against doing things like this, and I could talk at length about it, but I do think it has been a very good move. It has certainly eliminated some major problems that we were encountering. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I didn't even notice. Could somebody give me a sense of how long I've been talking?
Yeah, you've been talking for about 20 minutes. So yeah, 2 or 3 minutes probably.
Great, perfect. So I'll just kind of briefly jump ahead then. So one thing that I suppose go straight to the sort of the conclusions really. So the major challenges we faced were scale issues. So we needed a lot of staff to have either a lot or a sufficient amount of familiarity and or expertise. Students were being taught, a large number of students were being taught in a large number of small groups. I didn't maybe emphasize that, but all those workshops, all those labs, they were the largest class size would have been around 40 students. So you've got around 3,000 students in total, all divided up into a small number of groups, and trying to keep everything consistent across all these different groups in terms of teaching style was very difficult. And it just simply didn't happen, really. We know that students are getting a kind of a different experience depending on what group they're in. And also then providing that level of close support is quite difficult when you've got that many students. So there's a lot of questions that students will have, and making sure that just kind of technical questions, and making sure that they get answers to those is quite challenging. So in terms of how the students react and how the staff react, I think that's maybe a major question that people will wonder about. So from my perspective, the students don't really have a problem. It's not a major problem or a very different problem to what they would normally have. So we do get some responses that are unusual in comparison to what was happening with SPSS. So one is that students say, "What's this? Code. I didn't come to psychology to learn code. I don't want to be a programmer." And they think that they're being taught programming, even though they're actually not being taught programming. They are just writing code to do something. So you have to kind of explain that to them. There is a lack of engagement problem. There always was a lack of engagement problem, and it can affect them badly, because if you don't try to learn, or you can't blag your way through it. You have to spend some time learning how to use it, or you just can't do anything. And so that becomes an issue. And there's a sense also in which some students think that they're not the type of person who can do this type of stuff, like write code or anything technical. And so that when they encounter problems, which of course they do, because we all do, they feel like this is just proof that they're not supposed to be doing this, and they don't try to solve it. So we all encounter errors, but there's a sense in which some people will say, "This is a problem that I can solve," and others say, "Well, this is a problem that I'm just clearly not designed to solve." So a bigger issue, though, is about staff and the sort of their buy-in of this whole kind of move to R. And so, just as in my conclusions here, I'll just maybe mention that. So. So we did find that there was really, despite there was a number of staff who were very against moving to R, and they thought it was going to be a total disaster, and it just wasn't. There wasn't any student mutiny. Students were not up in arms and saying, "Bring back SPSS." It was just not an issue. They did not think that they were being somehow shortchanged by being not taught R, SPSS, and being taught R instead. They didn't even think about it, because how would they? They just came into their degree and were taught in a particular way, and they just accepted the reality of it. So whilst maybe all students don't love R, and want to become data scientists, some do, but not all. But it was never, when we were teaching SPSS, it was no different, right? They did not love SPSS. They did not. And so the fact that they don't all love R is just, well, it's just the same as what's happening before. And like in general, then we we think that students are learning what they need to learn in terms of data analysis and statistics with no more difficulty than there was the case with SPSS, and no more pain than there was with SPSS. It's very, very similar. So it wasn't as if it was some great paradise with SPSS. It just wasn't. And so it's really no different now. I would say that the standards of statistics in the department of the undergraduates has gone up. We see that in their research. So they're doing more advanced stuff. Even the less advanced stuff is being done to a higher quality, I think. And I think that is because of just the wider range of tools that are available in R. And a kind of a final problem then is that there are still remainers. So this move to R was in our department was kind of like Brexit. You know, there was like two big camps, and there was the Remainer camp, and there's still a camp, a Remainer camp, and a kind of a Refusnik camp as well, saying, look, I didn't want to move to R, so I'm not going to learn R. It's just I'm sticking to my guns with SPSS. So that's an ongoing problem, but it is getting better. So it is. We're 4 years in now, and it's just not as fraught as it was a few years ago. So I remain hopeful that this will just become the new normal, and people will forget that SPSS ever existed. So I will end with on that note.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was
Thank you, and
sorry
for running over if I did.
No, that's okay. So we've got time really for one question. Unfortunately, Dawood has a question, so fire away, Dawood. You're muted. Oh, perhaps.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, Mark. Thank you for very interesting talk. So I just have one quick question. It was very excellent overview of how we approach big classes, especially those with service courses. I teach 500 of commerce students, and we have recently moved to show them R. But my experience this semester is, so we initiated using Jamovi. I don't know, have you heard of that? Which is a mixture of I don't say SPSS, but it has drop-down menu, and also we can show them coding. Have you tried this, or do you have any feedback from this on your course?
Yeah. So that's a good point. We had a many year long debate about moving away from SPSS, and one of the arguments was because SPSS is a relatively expensive product and not open source. And so in that discussion, then people considered these alternatives to R. Jamovi was one, and then JASP is another one. And well, we ultimately in our department came to the conclusion that R was the best way to go. But I think a number of other departments who had similar debates concluded instead to go with JASP or Jamovi. And now so whilst I have not ever taught with them in any really serious way, just kind of just slightly a few years ago, I do know that others have moved to those products and are quite happy with them as well. I think personally, I think it's better to go with R. I think R is a more powerful tool. It's a more widely used tool. I think coding is better. I don't think it's as difficult as our students find it as difficult as somehow it's made. It's the myth implies that they do, but I think that if people want to get away from SPSS as a proprietary commercial tool and want something like it, those other ones, Jamovi and Jasper.
Yeah, I agree totally. So and we are not moving to Jamovi fully. I think it's mainly for first year where they just gonna learn the basic things, and that's their first year in college. So maybe they have very limited knowledge to programming. So. And then from second year, we rely heavily on R.
All right.
But it was nice to get your input on that and see how others working. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. I can see we've got one more question. So Margaret, if you've got a quick question.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mark. My question's of a practical nature. I'm thinking of people being reticent about transitioning from SPSS to R, and in particular, the concern that some people may have about the time involved in recreating the resources rather than just an anti-R attitude. So there's probably another fancy name you can give to that category. But the question I would like to ask is, do you have any tried and tested tips for making the transition a more smooth and appealing process? Because two things spring to mind. One in particular is sometimes there can be issues with comparing like with like, and that can be a challenge. And then secondly, I think nowadays SPSS has been updated to allow some kind of translation process from one type of code to another. So it's just a few ideas thrown in there to feed your reply. I'd be interested to hear, however, what you have to say.
Yeah. So are there ways of making it more the transition more smooth? Perhaps there are, but I do think that one part of it is just whether or not the staff believe in this. So in my department, there's a large number of staff, and some staff never used R at all, but were very happy to learn it, and learn it quite quickly as well. And it was amazing how much they learned in such a short space of time. That's just because they had an attitude that was just it was not an anti-R attitude. It was saying, okay, I haven't used this before, but I'm going to learn it, and I'm going to learn it quickly as well. But then others said, look, this learning R thing is just too time consuming. It's going to take years and years, and it'd be like mastering a foreign language, and I just don't have time for that. And this is just a major imposition on me, so I'm not going to. And then years and years later, they're still not very familiar. So with R, and so I think it's a matter. I don't think there's as much work involved in learning R and transitioning from like at an individual level from something like SPSS to R. But I do think you have to have a certain attitude, and it's either there or it's not. I don't think you can force anyone to do that. So I don't think I'm answering your question, because it's not really a tip. I'm just saying that I think is a factor that maybe you can't control. But if that, depending on how that factor, the extent of that factor, like how many people are willing or unwilling, that can make the transition very smooth or very difficult.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to all our speakers and to everyone for coming along and for all your questions. Is there any last minute thing you wanted to say, Michael, before we finish?
I think, so Simon, really just to sort of echo the thanks that you had there to Ainsley, to Craig, Andy, and Mark. I think we should wish Russell all the best, and hope he gets well soon. But a big thank you to all our speakers. I think the great thing about these events where you've got multiple speakers is you get to see different examples of practice, the learning that colleagues have pulled from it as well. And I think it's always really quite fascinating to see examples of learning and teaching practice. I think the final thanks, Simon, go to you for expert chairing and holding the whole thing together. I think very well done. And also to, again, I think we should thank Eleanor as well, because it's you that have put all the work into bringing this together. And I think we're delighted to have it through Talmo. So a big thank you. And I'm happy if you want the final word, Simon.
No.
Then I think we'll wish everybody a good rest of the day. And please do look out for more Talmo activities. We continue to add things. Please, I think, to echo earlier comments, if you've got ideas or things you want to see as part of Talmo, please do come forward to us with proposals, because I think we'd really be delighted to hear from you. So big thank you to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.